This video is to show you how to completely tear down your clone GT, as well as some common troubleshooting tips along the way. First, we'll remove the grips. I already took off 5 of the 6 screws, just because removing the grips is simple. Take the grips off. Remove the battery next. And then you can remove the screen from the board. It's attached to the board with just 6 little prongs. Just be careful not to bend any of the prongs when you remove or install it. Make a note of where the wires go in the board, so when you reassemble you don't have any issues connecting them to the wrong spot. This is the left side eye, this is the right side receiver, the black and yellow, and then the black and red here is the solenoid wires. So let's remove those wires from the board. And just be careful when you're removing them to not pull the connectors themselves off the board. Okay. Alright, move the ASA knob here. And we'll remove the actual ASA. The ASA is attached with 5/32 Allen. Just don't use a ball end Allen wrench when you're removing these, as it's easy to strip the screw. If you do that, there's 2 screws that secure it to the frame. Once those are loose, the ASA will just pull right off, and you'll see the screws. In order to get them in, you have to insert them from the bottom by placing them through here and sliding one over this way and one over the other way. And then there's an O-ring here that in between the two, the frame and the ASA. So we'll set that aside. Next, we will remove the grip frame. It's a 1/8. It's secured to the body with 2 screws. I like to loosen each one a little before I remove it completely. Okay, and then just slip the wires through. We'll put the body aside for a moment. And to remove the trigger, use a 1/16 and remove the trigger pin. And the trigger just pops out. All you have here is the spring as well as 2 bearings here. Just make sure you don't lose any of that. And then in order to remove the board, it's a 3/32. There's 1 screw at the bottom. And then there's 1 Phillips screw here. I don't have my Phillips right next to me, so I'm just going to leave the board in there, but if you take that Phillips screw out, the board just simply lifts out and you can put it to the side. Next, let's remove the regulator and the regulator housing. To remove the reg, just take a 1/4 inch Allen wrench and unscrew it. The reg will come out, the piston will be still in there. Easiest way is to use a 1/8 Allen wrench and just sort of insert it into the bottom of the piston and just sort of push it to one side and pull the piston out like this. Just be careful you don't gouge the bottom of the piston at all, the piston shaft. I'll put that aside. If you potentially get a leak out of the bottom of the reg, which isn't very common, there's an O-ring under here. First we'll separate the bottom works from the O-ring retainer. Just put an Allen wrench through these 2 holes here in the retainer. And if you'll want to use a good set of Allens, some of them will bend if this is a little snug. The first time I removed this, I used a pick. You can also use a drift or anything made out of steel, but simply break those free. That separates the O-ring retainer from the bottom works. You have your filter here. Just make sure that that's clean. And then here you have your adjuster, and then the reg seat. You take the reg seat out by putting a small Allen through the bottom here, and the reg seat pops right out. Just inspect the reg seat for damage. You can get some inconsistency, reg creep, or a few things if the reg seat has pitting or gouges on it. If it does, you can simply flip it over, and then you'll have to replace it the next time. Below the reg seat, there's a O-ring that's kind of tough to see. It's a 1x6 metric in there, and if there is a leak out the bottom here, that's typically going to be your culprit, is that O-ring right there. Put that back in. We'll set this aside. Now to get the reg housing off, there's 2 screws. There's one here on the outside, which is just 1/8, and then there's one on the inside. It's a black screw, and it is 3/16. Now I wouldn't typically use a ball end for this. You'll want to use, a T-handle or, an Allen wrench, a screwdriver tool, but mine I loosened up a little bit already, so it's pretty easy to unscrew. This is the screw that attaches it, and on the base of this screw is a 1x4 metric O-ring. If you get any leaks between the frame and the reg housing, the body and the reg housing, the first thing that I would check is that particular O-ring to make sure it's not shredded at all, and also make sure that this screw is snug in there. If it happened to loosen up at all, you could get a leak from between here, and sometimes it actually sounds like a squeaking noise. We'll remove the other screw. Alright, and that's that. Now we can start removing the solenoid and the subplates. You have subplate A here, and subplate B is the larger one behind it that the solenoid sits on. So first we'll remove subplate B and the solenoid, then we'll remove the eyes, then we'll remove subplate A. So remove the solenoid first. And this is a 5/64, the same one you used to remove the grip screws. The actual grips, not the grip frame, to the body. And the solenoid simply lifts off, and it has a few O-rings beneath it. Just inspect those and make sure they're in good shape. These O-rings don't typically fail. They're static, you know, they never move, so they're typically fine. And we can remove subplate B, which just has one O-ring on the bottom of it, which is where the air first passes through, you know, through the grip frame. And that's also the same Allen wrench you just used to remove the noid. 2 screws holding this down. They're the same exact type of screw that is one of your, you know, screws that holds the grips on. And the easiest way to remove this is to just kind of grab it from the back and slide it up and then pull it back. You have a couple O-rings here that join subplate B and subplate A, and then you also have 3 O-rings on the bottom. You know, now's a good time just to inspect those, but again, these don't typically fail as they're static O-rings. Now we'll remove the eyes. So remove the eye covers first. With a 3/32. Remove the detent as well. Now's a good time just to inspect your detents, make sure there's no, you know, missing chunks or cracks or anything like that, and these are in perfect shape. That one is. And then this is where you can remove the eyes. You just sort of slide out, pull out through there, through the subplate. You know, just be patient here. You know, they can snag up a little bit as they pass through, so do not be rough with these. You know, use a little tool if you have to move them around in there and fish them out. Move the other eye. Just remember, the red and white wire is always, you know, the driver's side, left side. And the black and yellow is the right side. Okay. Now subplate A simply lifts off. Or it's easy just to kind of dump it off. And then you have 2 O-rings on the bottom side of subplate A and no O-rings on the top side. And that's it. Now we're just left with our body. So we'll remove the drivetrain. And all we're left with on that is the feed neck. Feed neck lever. Simply unscrew. Put that aside, and then a 1/8 inch Allen to remove the feed neck from the marker. And I'm going to leave it on there. I just don't feel like removing it right now because it's lined up perfectly, but that's how you remove it. Just simply remove this screw and it pops right off. We'll set the body aside. Remove the back cap with the 1/8 inch Allen. Okay. Separate the drivetrain inside the back cap that sits on the rear of the power tube cap, you have this piece here, and then a small spring that attaches to the pull pin detent. So if you remove the pull pin itself, and just make note of which direction this goes in. If you look at the back, you know, the hole is offset a little closer towards the bottom, so the large side of the pull pin matches up with the, you know, larger gap difference here between the, you know, top and the hole. So, you know, if you put this on upside down, it'll be really apparent when you reassemble, and you can, you know, take the back cap back off and, you know, flip the pull pin. So once the pull pin's out, then you're left with the pull pin detent, which you can just take an Allen and push it out. And this is just a, you know, what the pull pin goes against here to sort of snap into place, so to speak. If you ever have any leaks out the back and you can't tell where it's coming from, check this O-ring to make sure it's good, make sure the detent is actually seated all the way in. Other than that, the only thing that could cause a leak out the back of the body would be this O-ring here. It's an O20 O-ring. So check this O-ring on the pull pin detent and this O20, and if those are both good, you shouldn't have any leaks out the back. Alright, so we're going to start reassembly, and I'll explain some of these pieces as we go along, and you know, what to look for if the marker's leaking in a certain area. So, okay. And just make sure, you know, this has a tiny bit of lube on it. It's relatively dry right now, so let's put we'll just sort of wet it a little. Just kind of push that in here. Make sure it's all the way in. And we'll put our pull pin back the same way we removed it. Large side towards the large gap. And then the drivetrain. This is your power tube. This is your valve keg. This is your power tube cap. This is the valve itself. This is the bolt keg spacer. This is the bolt keg. This is the bolt. Oh, actually, put this back here where it goes. So first we'll just reattach this to the power tube back cap. And on the valve, the larger diameter part is towards the front of the marker, and the valve slides in that direction, with the larger beveled out edge of the valve facing the larger side of the valve keg rather. So we'll insert that. And then as for the bolt, that slides through the bolt keg, and the spacer goes on in the back. And just make sure the spacer's not on backwards, because you can physically put it on backwards. Make sure the, you know, the larger diameter section and the O-ring are towards the front of the marker. We'll attach the valve keg to the bolt keg. And then the power tube slides in the back. The power tube cap finishes connecting everything. Now if you get any leaks out the trigger guard area, could be a few things. The first things to check would be the 3 O-rings on the valve itself, the power tube mid O-ring, which is this O-ring here, and also the bolt switch O-ring, which is this O-ring here, right in the middle of the bolt. Any of those O-rings could result in a leak out the trigger guard area. I like to make sure that the valve O-rings are sealing. If any of them aren't sealing, you can get a leak out the trigger guard area. Easiest way to do that is just to remove all but one of the O-rings and you know, put the valve in and make sure you feel, you know, a little bit of friction, and then move on to the next one and then the next one, and just make sure you feel good, a little bit of friction each time. That way you know you have a seal on those. And you can do the same for the, you know, power tube O-rings by hand sliding it onto the bolt, and you can remove this one here and then, you know, be able to easily test the back one. And you can kind of get a sense of it doing it like this, but it's easier to do it one at a time if you're really trying to either hand fit your O-rings or troubleshoot a potentially O-ring that might be a little potentially too small, which could result in not sealing. If you're getting a leak out the barrel of the gun, O-rings to check are the bolt keg inner, which is on the front of the bolt keg, the power tube tip O-ring, and an unlikely O-ring, but it is possible, would be the front O20 O-ring. Those are typically the three O-rings that could have an issue with a leak down the barrel. Alright, so let's reassemble the drivetrain. Any efficiency issues you have as well, if you don't feel you're getting good enough efficiency, the valve and power tube O-rings play a big role in efficiency, so making sure that, you know, they have good friction and are making a good seal and are nick and gouge free are important when it comes to efficiency. Alright, so let's just reassemble things here again. Reattach the back cap. You don't have to tighten that too much, just snug it up. Alright, I also like to take a straight through the body, but I don't have one next to me at the moment, so no big deal there. I've taken this apart a few times today, so. When you're doing this, you're going to want to make sure that this is the perfect time to make sure there's no gunk in your eye holes, as gunk can form there over time. So I'll typically take a Q-tip and just sort of pull most of the cotton off, and it fits real nice through the eye holes and gets all the gunk out of there. I also make sure the detent notches are, you know, clean. Just make sure every hole here is cleaned out. Okay, so let's put the drivetrain back in. You know, you can put this in last if you want, or now, it doesn't really matter. Alright, and just make sure this is a perfect time to just kind of wipe everything clean. And we'll clean off our subplates. We'll start with subplate A. And I like to make sure that there's just a tiny bit of grease on any of these O-rings. Just a real little bit. Just put a tiny dab on your finger. I just kind of rub my fingers together just to wet them with lube. And I just kind of dab at the O-rings just to get them a tiny bit wet so they're not dry. Alright, we'll drop subplate A on, like that. We'll clean off subplate B. just do the same thing with the lube, just a little bit. On any of those O-rings. Alright. Oh, can't forget to the connect A to B. Now when you're connecting this, you don't just want to put it straight down, because these O-rings can get pinched and they will not function well if they're pinched. So sort of slide it on from the back towards the front like that, and then drop this down and just sort of pull forward, and that should just drop right in there. We'll put our 2 screws in. Just do them both just snug until both of them are snugged up, and then, you know, finish tightening them after both are slightly snugged. These don't have to be super tight, just snug. You don't want to strip the aluminum. Okay, once that's done, we want to put our eyes back through. Alright, so easiest way is just to put a slight curve on the end. And you know, the first time doing this, or you know, even after you're used to it, it can be a little bit of a pain sometimes. But you want to put the red and white eye through the left side of the gun and put it right through this hole here, and then it'll just pop right out like that. Put that through, and then we'll do the other one here before we put any of the covers back on. Do the same thing here. The second one's usually a little more tricky than the first one. And the yellow and black goes through the right side. Put that through. And, alright, good, they behaved. And then you want to, the best way to run the eyes is to, whichever side of the marker they go into, so the yellow and black one here is to run it across and down the opposite side next to the solenoid when we do that. And so this one went on this side, so we'll run it on the opposite side. But we'll do that after we put the solenoid in. For now, make sure the eye is through the eye socket and snug in there. We'll put the detent in. Just make sure it sits in the groove. And we'll put our eye cover back on. And we'll do the other one. Sometimes the eyes can be a little bit of a pain to get in there, but you just kind of got to wiggle it around until it sits in the socket. Alright, we'll put our solenoid on. Just be careful you don't lose the screws like I almost just did. And you know, just clean some of the, you know, the grease that's shot out of it. You know, just sort of clean it up a little bit, and I'll dab a tiny bit on these O-rings as well. Just enough to wet them, like the subplates. And then put the subplate, put the solenoid on the subplate. There's 2 raised screw receivers, so just drops on, right like that. And do not over tighten these screws, because it's going into aluminum and they do not need to be very tight, just snug. And a lot of times people will think that the solenoid's venting air every time they pull the trigger, The solenoid can vent a little bit of air, but more typically, if that's happening, you're going to want to look more towards the same troubleshooting as a leak out the trigger guard, the valve O-rings and the power tube mid or the bolt switch. That can also sort of puff air out that area, and it's kind of tough to tell when everything's assembled. So, all right, we'll just kind of snug these up, not too tight. Okay, once that's done, put our reg housing back on. Just clean off the underside. Paint has a way of finding its way in there a little bit, so now's the time to clean it off. Okay. So this black screw, the 3/16, I like to just sort of put it on the end and work it up through until it pops out, and then start it in the hole this like this. Can be a little bit of a pain, but you will get it eventually. Okay, so don't tighten that all the way yet. Put the other screw on first and get that one snug before we tighten them both down. So now we'll tighten this one up, and we'll tighten this one up. And as I said before, you should use a T-handle or a regular screwdriver style Allen to really snug this up properly. It doesn't have to be too tight, but get it good and snug. All right. Once that's on, I guess we'll put our reg back in. So reattach the bottom works to the O-ring retainer. Screw that back in, and it does not have to be super tight, just snug it up a tiny bit. And I like to put the piston through this way, and if you're getting any reg creep or your first shot's hot or anything like that, check the piston O-ring here. If you're getting a lot of venting out the little hole in the front of the reg housing, same thing. Check the piston O-ring, check both O-rings while you're in here. So slide that back in. We'll tighten it up. We'll put our frame back on. First, let me put the screw back in that I removed from the bottom of the board. And you don't have to tighten this too much either. You don't want to snap the board. Okay. Now this is when you just want to really be careful that we don't pinch wires. If you pinch them too bad, you can shear the wire casing off, the insulation, and you can easily damage a set of eyes or your solenoid wires that way. I like to ride them alongside the solenoid like this, which is pretty much the way you have to do it. And you can get them through the frame any way you see fit. I find it's easiest to just sort of give them a little bit of a twist together. kind of snag the wires. And this is when you just want to be really careful. Do not screw down the grip frame yet until you know that the wires are cleanly in there. You can see right when you put it on, like the wires, you know, have a tendency to want to hang out. So just kind of run your finger alongside and, you know, do that on both sides. And if you do that, you know, the wires will not get damaged. So, you know, you can untwist them here or screw it in first then untwist them, but they're good right now. They're free, there's no binding. So we'll put the screws back in and we'll snug them both up before we tighten fully. So those are snug. Now let's tighten them. They don't have to be overly tight here either. No screw really has to be overly tight. Alright, once that's done, put the wires in the right spot from where you noted earlier. I like to hook up the Noid first. And just make sure the wires aren't, you know, crossing over themselves too much. You know, just kind of put them in cleanly. Okay. Attach the Noid wire to the rightmost socket. And then the yellow and black to the middle socket. And lastly, the red and white to the leftmost socket. And we'll just sort of tuck those in there so they look, you know, clean. Then we can put the trigger back in, just with the spring and the trigger. Slide it through and make sure the spring rests in the spring perch. And put the trigger pin through the front hole once you see the bearing line up. And screw that in. Just make sure the spring is, you know, seated in there nice and not hanging out the side or anything. Okay. We can put our monitor back on. And the pins of the monitor will face, you know, they'll be towards at the bottom of this. So put it in, you know, this way. Just make sure you don't bend them, you get them all in, and just seats right in there like that. Okay. Now we will reattach our ASA. This is one of those things that can be, you know, a tiny bit tricky at first as well, because the screws can easily move from side to side. So you want the screws both sticking out the bottom like that. And just try to line them up the best you can. And just start with one. And that didn't work out well. Once you get that started, it's real simple. You start with the back one. Probably would have been a little easier if I had a screwdriver style Allen, but I didn't grab that. So that one's in. Now, again, these are ones you want to snug both up before you fully tighten. And some people, you know, have the ASA, you know, turn a tiny bit. You know, with a hard dive, it's easy. You know, the pressure of the tank and everything. This can, you know, turn a tiny bit and wobble on you. So, You know, one cure to that is to put a little bit of blue Loctite on these screws before you snug them up, and that typically alleviates that problem. I don't have the problem without the blue Loctite, but some people do, so that does help with it. You know, just make sure you align your ASA, you know, good. I go back and forth a couple times, you know, tightening a little bit each time. Until it's nice and snug. Don't go crazy here, but snug it up good. Once that's done, the ASA knob screws back in. And one last thing I didn't put back on was the feed neck lever. So just simply screw that back on, you know, however much you need to get your feed neck to lock in correctly. And the last part is just to reattach the grips, and you know, that's it. I left the battery out, but put the battery back in. And now you're 100% clone teardown.